Hey, good afternoon. My name is Wolfgang Schlör. I'm the Associate Provost for International Initiatives at Georgia State University. Welcome to the 2021 Chinese New Year Business Forum on rebuilding a mutually beneficial relationship between the US and China. And just as importantly, Happy Lunar New Year. The Office of International Initiatives at Georgia State is one of several co-hosts of this forum today. And we're thrilled to continue to support events that foster discussion and provide information about US-China business relations. Today's topic couldn't be more timely, as a new US administration is starting to outline its approach to international and trade relations, including with China. And I really look forward to the discussion we are about to hear. I want to thank our longstanding partners and co-hosts, the Chinese Business Association of Atlanta and the Carter Center. And I also want to thank our sponsor today, the China Research Center. We are grateful to our distinguished panelists and to our moderator today, Trevor Williams from Global Atlanta. Thank you all for joining us today. And at this point, I'm going to introduce our co-sponsor, co-host Jian Ni, who is the president of the Chinese Business Association of Atlanta. Jian?
Thank you, Dr. Schlör. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jenny. I'm the president of CBA. I want to welcome all of you for this annual event. And like Dr. Schlör said, couldn't be more timely right now to discuss this topic of rebuilding the bilateral relationship between China and the US. I do want to especially thank Kimberly Henshaw, who's from Georgia State Office of International Initiative, who took the initiative, and the name is very appropriate for her to organize this event. And I also want to thank Dr. Yawei Liu and the Carter Center for joining us for this, and as well as the panelists and Trevor, the moderator. Trevor is I was joking the other day, he's an old hand in terms of the international community here in Atlanta. And he's traveled to China several times to learn about the relationship and the situation in China. So once again, I want to thank all of you for participating. And I'm looking forward a well-rounded and a mutually beneficial relationship between China and the US, and that will benefit all of us, the Chinese Americans here in the States. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce to Dr. Yawei Liu from the Carter Center.
Thanks, Jen. And my name is Yawei Liu. I wear two hats today. The first hat is I'm the Associate Director of the China Research Center, which is the proud sponsor of today's webinar. China Research Center is housed at Island Island College of Liberal Arts at Georgia Tech. The second hat I wear is I'm the Senior Advisor on China at the Carter Center. We all know that 42 years ago, President Carter and Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping made the courageous decision to establish diplomatic relationship between China and the United States. You know, that decision, as President Carter likes to say, has changed the US, has changed China, and has changed the world. And 2 days ago, on February the 23rd, the Carter Center released a report on how to stabilizing and sustaining US-China relationship. And particularly, the report focuses on the role of civil society and NGOs. The next, our moderator is Trevor Williams, who is a native son of Georgia, but he's a reporter of the new digital age. He has traveled, as Jen said, to many countries, particularly countries in Asia. So he's the best person to really moderate today's decision. Trevor?
Thanks, Yawei. Yeah, a lot to live up to there with your kind introductions. I really appreciate that. As y'all mentioned, I'm the managing editor at Global Atlanta. Just briefly, we are an international business news service here in Atlanta, online only, firmly entrenched in the digital realm, as you mentioned, that covers Georgia's relationships with various countries overseas and its place in the global economy. So I've been privileged enough to write a lot about the U.S.-China relationship, but particularly the Georgia-China relationship in the avenues of trade and investment. So very happy to be here and continue learning more about what's going on. So the way we're going to go about this right now, I'm going to introduce each panelist one by one, and they're going to have a few minutes just to discuss what they are, just a little bit more about their companies and what they may be doing in China, just so we set a firm foundation. Then we'll launch into our panel discussion. At the bottom of the screen, as we all know by now, having done Zoom meetings ad nauseum, I think there's a chat function where you can chat at the panelists, but also there's a Q&A function, and I would welcome questions throughout the conversation. We're going to have a designated Q&A time at the end, but if something spurs a thought while we're discussing something, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A so that we're not hearing crickets when we get to the end and wanting y'all to engage. We really want this to be an engaging conversation. So we're going to start out with PJ Bain, who's the CEO of Prime Revenue. I've been lucky enough to write about Prime Revenue quite a bit here in Atlanta in the context of Atlanta's role as a financial technology hub. PJ is an established software and tech entrepreneur. He's got a long background and also in manufacturing automation, I noticed, which was kind of relevant to our discussion today. But joined Prime Revenue as CEO in July of 2009. So for over a decade, he's been leading this company that's had some phenomenal growth. PJ, just give us a foundation about Prime Revenue, what y'all do, what in the world is supply chain finance, and help us get a grip on that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Trevor. I appreciate the kind introduction. I'm sort of getting to the age where when I hear the introduction and the decades of experience, it makes me very glad that I'm still able to get up and participate in these types of discussions. Very much looking forward to the discussion today. As Trevor mentioned, I'm the CEO of Prime Revenue. I feel very lucky to be part of a great team that is headquartered here in Atlanta, Georgia. We're a financial technology company, a fintech. We're a technology-enabled service business that delivers a service to global supply chains around the world. And that service is called supply chain finance. I'm going to assume that everyone is relatively familiar with how supply chains work, but in a very simplistic explanation, just from a terminology perspective today, we work with companies that buy products and services from suppliers. The buyer is the one receiving the goods and services, and the supplier is the one providing those goods and services. The way that transaction typically works just about everywhere in the world in global trade is that the buyer will place an order, the supplier will ship those products, and they're received by the buyer. The supplier will send an invoice, the buyer receives that invoice, approves that invoice, and then based upon the payment terms that are typically negotiated with the supplier, that invoice is going to be paid at some point in the future, 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 270 days, sometimes 360 days from when the invoice is received and approved. And that's where we come in. We provide a platform and a network of banks and financial institutions that we work with around the world, well over 100, that are very interested in purchasing that invoice immediately at a very efficient discount, which gives the supplier immediate access to cash. So instead of financing their customer, they receive that payment on that invoice immediately, and that allows them to invest that money back into their business to grow, sustain, expand, strengthen, buy more products to continue to accelerate. So in a very simplistic model, that's what we do. We do millions of transactions every day for 40,000 clients in 80 countries around the world. So even though we're headquartered in Atlanta, we very much are global companies. We have colleagues all over the world. We operate in well over a couple dozen languages around the world. We operate in 30 currencies around the world. In 2021, this year, we will process well over $250 billion in B2B payments. Those are all trade payments, including a very large exposure. The majority of our payments are cross-border trade payments. A lot of that is a tremendous amount of exposure between US and China and Europe and China, cross-border trade payments. Much of our business, nearly half of our business and over half of our staff are outside of the US, including offices in London, Prague, and Hong Kong. Like you, Trevor, I've spent a lot of time in Asia and have been part of not only with Prime Revenue, but with other businesses in opening gateways for the business, for technology businesses to be able to service clients in Asia and Hong Kong. The global relationships that we have with China have been both a blessing for our company and our employees, as well as a challenge. The last couple of years have been increasingly challenged. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion today and appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Great, thanks, BJ. Yeah, we'll certainly dive into a lot of that, a lot of the nuts and bolts of this later in the discussion. Next, I wanted to bring in Ginger Merritt. Ginger is the Vice President of Performance, Colorants, and Ingredients at Milliken & Company. And Milliken, if y'all don't know, is a firmly established Southern textile and chemical company that is widely admired for its environmental and responsibility and work around the world, based in Spartanburg, South Carolina. And Ginger joined in June 2020. I wonder what that was like, joining in the middle of a pandemic. We'll maybe talk about that a little bit. But she has more than 30 years of business experience, including 13 years in China and across Southeast Asia. So I'm excited about getting her to share some of that experience with us today. Ginger, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what you do at Milliken and what its relationship with China is like.
Okay, yeah. I'll just mention, Milliken is a family-owned and professionally managed international company with a presence in China for several decades across all kinds of industries, from floor covering, carpet, to healthcare, and also the specialty chemicals and plastics areas. So my association, as you mentioned, with China, my affiliation with China has been working there and living there for more than 13 years. I have a passion for China. I firmly believe that the China-US relationship is one of, if not the most important relationships between countries that we can have in the world. And if we don't get that right, we've got bigger problems, right? So I look forward to sharing some of my insights on living and working there and how we can improve the relationships for mutually beneficial benefits going forward.
Great. Thank you so much, Ginger. Next, we've got William Chun, who's the President and CEO of Moons Enterprise Incorporated and Lean Engineering, Inc. William also has over 30 years of experience. I'll ask him to go ahead and unmute. I think he's already done that. He's President and CEO of Moons Enterprise America, President and CEO of Lean Engineering. I think you're based right outside of Silicon Valley or in Silicon Valley right now, William?
Yes, correct.
Perfect. Well, thank you for joining us. You've got a long and illustrious bio, but I'm going to let you explain more about yourself. I think everybody's got the link to all the bios that was placed in the chat. But tell us a bit more about Lean Engineering in particular. I think that's the hat you're wearing today, and what you do there in California.
Yeah, I believe the bio information already talk about what we are and what we do. So we are private. It's private owned company, and it start invest in the U.S. quite 20 years ago. And to myself, actually, it's about international. Actually, I spent 10 years to do business, in Europe. Then the recent 20 years in total in U.S. So today, I would take this opportunity to share our practice and stories and informations about what's the preferred strategy to run a business in the U.S. So that
Great.
invested by the Chinese company. So I'm looking forward to such communication with everyone of us.
Y'all are just helping us get ahead of schedule here. Y'all aren't taking all your time, so this is good. We'll have more time to get into the meat of the discussion. And I'm particularly interested in your topic, William, because I've written a lot about Chinese companies coming to Georgia and their triumphs and travails over the years, over the past 10 or 15 years. And I think we can always learn more about how to smooth that process a little bit. Lastly, not least, of course, we've got Dr. Yawei Liu, who is the Director of China Programs at the Carter Center. And you've heard a little bit from him already. Yawei, why don't you tell us a bit more about, I think people should hear a bit more about your historical interactions with China and the kinds of things that you've done through the Carter Center, particularly just finding avenues for collaboration when it hasn't been always that easy in the bilateral relationship. Here, can I unmute you?
William and I actually came from the same city. I don't know when William came from Xi'an. I went to Hawaii from Xi'an in 1987, and I moved to Atlanta in 1989. So I've been here. That's how much I love Atlanta. I joined the Carter Center in 1996 as a volunteer. President Carter visited China after he was defeated and left the White House in 1981. You know, he and Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping, they're good friends. And President Carter said, you know, we had a center. We would like to work with you guys. You know, can you tell me what we could do in China? And Deng Xiaoping told him, my son runs the National Association for the Disabled People. Maybe the Carter Center could help China on that front. So that's Carter Center's first project in China, is to provide training to special ed teachers in China, and also to supply a production line artificial limbs. And then in 1996, when I started volunteering at the Carter Center, the center was invited by China to observe grassroots democracy, village elections in China. So we monitored village elections in China from 1997 all the way to, I think the last mission to China was in 2011. In 2012, President Carter traveled to China and was told by the Chinese leader, we would like you to stop, quote unquote, interfering in our domestic affairs. You know, you're the one who made the decision to normalize relationship. So why don't you get the center to be more devoted and spend more resources on improving and advancing U.S.-China relationship. So now that's where we dedicate our time and the resources. We run 2 websites, one in Chinese and one in English. I put the link, both links to the chat room. You can check them out. That's my brief introduction and the brief history of the center's involvement in China.
Well, and the Carter Center has also been instrumental in putting Chinese and American scholars together. You've had a lot of forums in that regard. And I remember President Carter one time talking about how that originated. He got a call in the middle of the night because I think Deng Xiaoping was too excited to wait until the time difference had turned over, but started sending scientists and scholars back and forth very early after normalization, I think. And now, of course, China is the largest sending nation of students to the U.S. And so we'll talk maybe a little bit more about that. But Yahweh, since we've got you right now, I wanted to see if you could set the baseline for us a little bit politically. Obviously, you mentioned 2012. You didn't mention that was the year that President Xi came into power in China. Obviously, the last few years have been turbulent, to say the least, under President Trump and his initiatives to try to reorient the trading relationship and rebalance it more in favor of the U.S., or in his view, in favor of the U.S. I'm curious, because you have such insight into what the Chinese side is thinking. Where are we in terms of our credibility, reputation, dialogue, in terms of the U.S. and Chinese governments? Like, what is the state of our kind of interaction these days? And what sort of avenues are there left, really, to collaborate?
Thanks, Trevor. So I was asked to provide a baseline, which probably is going to be very difficult, but I have 4 quick observations, and let's see if they could serve as a baseline for today's discussion by the distinguished panelists. First point I want to make is things are different now. So there have been difficulties in the bilateral relationship. For example, the human rights issues after 1989, the Belgrade bombing of the Chinese embassy in 1999, and then the EP3 incident in 2001, and sales of weapons by the US to Taiwan. But what happened in the last couple of years is a paradigm shift. With the US government literally declaring the engagement with China that was began 42 years ago. If we're going to count ping pong diplomacy and Kissinger's secret trip to China, engagement actually began 50 years ago this year. And US government declared that engagement as being a fiasco. US engagement with China has enabled, this is the US leadership discourse, to grow its mind, its might, and its money. And the US now should do everything possible to contain the rise of China. My typical response to this declaration that engagement is a fiasco is it is historically blind, politically expedient, and diplomatically arrogant. My second point is, how do the two countries respond to the decoupling issue? On the surface, it appears the Chinese leadership cares more about engagement. The Chinese top leaders have never said anything detrimental to the relationship. But for American top leaders, from President Trump on down to David Stilwell, Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific Affairs, they day in, day out, they criticized China, they repudiated China. They basically told everyone here in the US that China is an evil country. China is bent on destroying American values and substituting the United States and edging US out of the Pacific area. China certainly cared a lot more about this relationship. This is reflected in China's decision to sign the first phase trade agreement. And I think the US will suffer equally if the bilateral relationship deteriorates beyond repair. However, it probably will trigger seismic political and economic changes in China as a result of decoupling, if that's going to unfold. It may even lead to a war between the US and China over Taiwan. My third issue is very much relevant to today's discussion, and that is the role of the American businesses and the Chinese businesses in the relationship. On the part of American businesses, they have been an anchor for bilateral engagement. Since 1989, US businesses have been pushing for engagement. But I think the Trump administration basically declared days of US business support for engagement is gone. I don't know whether that declaration is correct or not. We had a webinar on February the 18th. We have the president of US Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. They do survey of 1,500 American businesses in China. And according to the survey, majority of the American businesses are still making money in China. And according to the survey, the same survey, majority of American businesses have no plan to move out of China. So I remember a senior VP from Coca-Cola, coming to the center at one of our meetings that Trevor mentioned. He said the largest overseas market for Coca-Cola is Mexico. And China is the second largest overseas market for Coca-Cola. His comment is, one Chinese consumes as much Coke as Mexicans. Coca-Cola doesn't need to go anywhere to sell its product in the world. Can we imagine that one day Coca-Cola, UPS, Delta, Ginger's company or Bain's company, Williams company, can you imagine because of political pressure that the companies will relocate or they will sever any business relationship with China? So that's the role. I think that's crucial for this relationship to be stabilized and hopefully to be improved in the coming days. My last point, I think Trevor asked me about the leadership and particularly where President Biden positions himself. I think if you compare Biden to any other top American leaders, he probably is the one that has the most objective view of China. He understands what it takes for China, quote unquote, to steal the American lunch. It's very difficult. He doesn't believe China is capable of doing that. But the challenge is, how will President Biden respond to the toxic anti-China discourse and climate in Washington, D.C.? And second, how vulnerable he is to the GOP attack if he's believed to be going soft on China. So hopefully my remarks provide a baseline for the discussions of the next three distinguished panelists.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. That last point is, President Biden seems to be cautiously towing the water right now. I mean, I saw today just a small tweet where the new Biden's appointee for the U.S. Trade Representative was asked about her views on the phase one trade deal with China and whether that's going to be kept and whether it should be adhered to. And she was firmly saying that, China committed to this and we're going to move ahead with this. And also, there's been no movement on tariffs, right? As far as I understand, Biden did not come in and just sweep away everything Trump did. This seems to be a new baseline that he has to operate with at this point. I wanted to bring in maybe Ginger on this point because over the last few years, obviously, it's been a roller coaster in terms of tariffs and trade policy. I wondered if you could just give us a sense. I know you're relatively new at the company, but you've been in China for so long, or worked in China so long. What was it like? I mean, is it whiplash on the ground when you're trying to understand how to navigate these rapidly changing tariffs, and did that affect Milliken directly?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah. So the tariffs in Milliken and also my previous company in China was definitely impacted by the tariffs. And interestingly enough, recently, what that has done is driven overseas investment. And I will mean overseas investment, meaning China coming to the U.S., as a matter of fact. So we saw quite a number of manufacturing operations of Chinese companies, which were flush with cash and maybe sometimes with government subsidies, establishing facilities in the U.S. And so we took this as an opportunity to provide support to these Chinese producers entering into the U.S. market, not only supplying materials to them, but helping to make connections with the local authorities, providing consultancy, also connecting them with the U.S. customers. So the supply chains were severely disrupted in a lot of market segments. And we took this as an opportunity, and also, again, to further build the relationships with our Chinese customers and suppliers. And again, I think that these relationships, these people-to-people relationships, transcend a head of the company and a head of the governments. It's the people-to-people relationships there. So this is, I think, the further evidence that these personal connections, they bring mutual benefit to the China-U.S. relationships when we get down to boots on the ground and how we can forge strong business relationships.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about that. Like when you're in a boardroom in your China operation, right, and you're worrying about the next day's manufacturing quota, right? Are you thinking about, is the bilateral relationship on top of mind, or is it more of these operational challenges that you're dealing with that day? And how do you deal with that high level rhetoric when you're in these day-to-day conversations with your Chinese counterparts?
Yeah, I think it's both, Trevor, right? It is the boots on the ground part of it, which is the person to person. But when we talk about local authorities, I think everyone knows that in China, the authority management is a huge topic, much more so than in the U.S. and in Western Europe, for example. And we're talking, the authorities, we're talking at a state level, of course, at a provincial level, at a city level, at a municipal level, and even at a district level, and further down to an industrial park level. And so forging those relationships with those local authorities, understanding what's driving them, understanding their key initiatives, what they're looking for in their individual area of responsibility, and building that within what is important for your own company, and supporting them. This goes a long way in helping to build those relationships with those authorities and influencers. And it helps when we need support for our own businesses. Not to mention the positive brand image that's conveyed through these efforts.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering about how you handle the leadership issue. I mean, is it mainly expat leadership that you bring in, or are you kind of working to cultivate a local Chinese leadership pipeline because they're dealing with this day to day? They understand how business relationships work and not having to learn that from scratch when they get there.
Yeah, I think it's changed a lot over the past 10, 15 years, right? It was very heavily expat focused when you looked at most international companies in China 10 to 15 years ago. And I see it taking a real different turn in the last 5 years. There's very strong, good, excellent Chinese talent, right? And we need to leverage that. And I think that's one of the things that Milliken does very well. Is engages the local employees because they're in the market, they're speaking the languages, they have the culture, they know what needs to be done for the local markets and to build those local markets, and in managing the authorities and making those relationships strong between the local authorities and the company.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I want to come back to you, Ginger. I wanted to ask William. Ginger brought up a good point about some Chinese companies investing in the U.S. because of the tariffs, and I do think you've seen acceleration in some sectors. Even certain, like I've written about certain Korean projects that have brought Korean-owned companies, but have brought their manufacturing from China into, or warehousing from China into the U.S. to deal with tariffs on, say, mattresses, for instance. And flooring, obviously a big industry for Georgia. It seems like every other month I'm writing about a new Chinese flooring company that's wanting to set up an operation in Northwest Georgia, presumably because something's going on with the tariffs there. But William, what have you seen in terms of trends of Chinese companies coming to the U.S. and what are some of the pitfalls that they have learned how to get around maybe in the last decade or so? And how's that environment changed recently?
Yeah, I like the word Ginger mentioned, boots on the ground. So my job is really good, boots on the ground. So in terms of business, I don't think is too much related on the environment changes. As a businessman, that's your job, to take reaction and tuning your strategy and to fit the different environments. So we can see quite many business, no matter what outside happens, still running pretty good, game great, increasing. Sometimes it's positive way. This is the way the challenger. It's a filtering those good business survival, and really a kind of lesson for those businessmen to see, how can you change your different way and different operations and make that happen, and really think about what way to exercise your core competency. So we heard many stories about this, and in the past decades, for those investment in China, in the U.S., how to run in the business after the strategic after investment. Someone to do simply make a copier, duplicate the operations in the U.S. That doesn't work. Or someone say, I do an investment in the U.S., build a lobby, beautiful, nice looking lobby, but keep all the operations still in China side or another side overseas. I tell you what, that also doesn't work, because the core point is not exercise the really core competency. So, our company here in Silicon Valley, really we're working with those giant companies for autonomous vehicles, robotics, medicals, and telecommunications, relatively in latest, advanced, and new technologies. So we gained 60% increase in the past 3 years, 60%, including COVID-19 2020 that year. So it's not because I personally do any good job. It's about the company's strategy. Company's strategy works.
Well, let me ask you about that too, because, would you attribute that to people needing more help navigating the entire system? Because, technology obviously has become the battleground really in terms of U.S.-China economic relations right now, with the U.S. Sanctions on Huawei, ZTE, all these strategic sectors, and really a lot of the origins of the Trump tariffs and everything were targeted at China's kind of government policy towards technology and wanting to do the Made in China 2025 program and these things that are seen to be threatening U.S. strategic advantage. So since you work in that field, I just wonder, are the Chinese company, they're still coming and able to navigate that side of things?
Yeah, I think so. I've done, in my point of view, in my lower level operation levels, I don't think it's a big impact to us. So, so many just normal technical normal operations, manufacturings is the difference, because actually after investment in US, you are no longer international companies. You are localized. You are US company. You hire US people, do the US job.
Yeah. You think the Chinese companies have gotten better at localizing over time? I've seen the American Factory documentary, right? Like everybody's seen that at this point.
That's a point to see if you really go make that happen or not. I like to mention what's the strategy we apply on. I like to start from amazing story. In March 2020, both General Motors and Google, two giant companies, get federal government order to produce tens of thousands ventilators for definite emergency use. So that moment is critical COVID-19 situation moment. However, these two companies and facing a big challenger. You know what? Switzerland was locked down. Switzerland locked down, where the key parts produced there. The supply chain suddenly cut it off. That is high-speed slotless motors. Everything about oxygen, this spatial micromotors driven the impeller driven the pumper supplying oxygen, and tough performance and tough reliabilities, because oxygen in, you are okay. If oxygen stopped, you know what's going to happen.
Right.
So that's why it's only Switzerland make that happens. But at that moment, the two giant companies have nothing can get out from Switzerland. They turn to us. Long story too short, so we make that happens in 90 days, 3 months, and day in, day out, and we produce those products in here in the US by our companies. It's about 30,000 ventilators we involved and delivered to hundreds of hospitals and medical facilities. So we are really honored about that, saving Americans' life. We are very proud of it. Obviously behind that, it's millions dollars. So the real point of this story that I want to share, and that story is because that kind of help to General Motors and Google start from the day while we are not ready. That kind of relative high-end products, not our products yet. Even we have the design, initial capability. At those moments, we can produce 30 pieces a day, but both companies need us 600 a day. So what we can do, we involving all the teams working, engineer to engineer, supply chain to supply chain, quality to quality, process to process, together with General Motors and Google's. So meetings follow the meetings, days, night, every day and night. Long story, so too short, we make that happen, but eventually we know that it's only can be happens in the US. It's only can be happens for our companies in the US. So it's no way if you are still internationally.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think those barriers are going to be popping up more frequently. You know, now there's been this wholesale reevaluation of our supply chains in terms of resiliency, right? And are we ready for the next threat, the next pandemic, or, you know, is our pharmaceutical supply chain safe from, you know, potentially Chinese hoarding of active ingredients? And there's all these discussions that are happening right now. And in that regard, I wanted to bring in PJ. We're not going to delve, you know, specifically into all the ins and outs of COVID-19. I think we'd be here all day for that, and we want to kind of look a little bit forward rather than too much backward. But at the same time, PJ, you had some really interesting insight in your data that y'all track on the buyers sourcing from China and their invoice activity, particularly right around this time last year when, you know, it was around Chinese New Year when COVID started proliferating across China, and then of course we saw it go around the world. But what did you kind of learn initially, and then since we're a year later, you know, how are things looking in China right now based on your data?
So I think that's a great question. I guess just to give the attendees a little bit of a context of the data that we see a massive amount of trade data. So we have data going back over very long periods of time. So anytime that a purchase is made for someone that's on our network, we see those invoices and we see the flow. We facilitate, we process the flow of that money. And so we see, so what those purchases help to show is, since it's purchases within the supply chain, eventually those goods in the supply chain are going to turn into finished goods. So you can consider what we're doing within the supply chain, work in process. Eventually they become finished goods, and that's an impact on what GDP looks like, or what the economic impact is going to be. So in a lot of ways, our data, when you look at the aggregated data within a region, within a market sector, cross-regional, is very much a leading indicator for what the economic reports are going to be 60 or 90 days down the road. And I think the conversation to date has been very interesting. So far in the conversation has been very interesting. Before I get to the specific answer, Trevor, we're really kind of having two different conversations at this point. We're talking about what happens at the operational level when the disruptions occur, and our data shows very specifically, you know, the link to regional closures and the impact that had. And those operational impacts, I think we've recovered from. I think we've adjusted to a new normal where uncertainty, volatility is the rule of the day. We have no idea what's going to happen today when we wake up, but we've become accustomed to, instead of as a CEO of a global financial technology, I've become accustomed to not only thinking about a year, 2 years, or 3 years down the road, I also have to think about next week, because there is probably going to be some new variable, whether it's supply chain related, COVID related, political related, that will make me think about what's going to happen in the coming days and the coming weeks. A year ago in March, when we were publishing a lot of our data, and you actually, I think, did an excellent job of writing about some of the observations that we were making and going a little bit deeper and connecting them to COVID happenings at the time, that wasn't the case. The boots on the ground were struggling to be able to deal with the operational impacts. I think we've done a very good job, as William and Ginger have very well explained, of dealing with those operations. We've not, at the executive level of the companies around the world that are facilitating global trade, I think we're just starting to think through the strategic implications. So while I think people have figured out business, I think there still will be adjustments to come within business of how to deal with that. So let me give a couple of instances of that. When the pandemic was really hitting, even before we knew it was a pandemic, we saw a great deal of disruption in the volume across our platform and across Asia. starting with China. We could go country by country, but we could see disruptions in supply chains before it was news. We're trying to figure out what's happening. Then when we understand what's happening, we can start to correlate those purchases and the flows within supply chains. And all of a sudden, most of the volume on our platform that we see are buyers. The purchasers are in North America and Western Europe. The suppliers are in China and Asia. And so the first impact that we saw was a supply shock. So all of a sudden the supply chain shut down and nobody could get product to China. China bounced back very, very quickly. They were down for 5 or 6 weeks, but the resiliency across the sort of the macro viewpoint of all of the supply chains was very quick. They ramped incredibly quick back. And then within 3 or 4 weeks, a demand shock hit the global supply chains, because you could literally watch almost day by day the pandemic marching across Europe and then hitting North America, and the demand of those. And so it took most of the latter half of Q2 and Q3 from our perspective for that data to normalize, those flows to normalize. We still have a great deal of volatility, but I believe that it has. However, coming out of that, we started to have some pretty dramatic implications, as Yahweh has mentioned, on saber rattling and rhetoric from the US administration. And there's a lot of culpability to go there. But I also think that there's culpability on the side of China, where we have human rights issues, we have issues related to the security laws, one of the best examples that I can give of that. There's crackdown. Our operations.
We're talking about in Hong Kong, right? The
Yeah, in Hong Kong.
law in Hong Kong.
That's right. Our operations are in Hong Kong, which is really the trade gateway. It's the trade and finance gateway to China for most of the Western world. And so, we're operated there. Many supply chain companies are operated there. Every bank in the world that does global trade finance has a base of operations there. And so, those types of things have created a situation where, our clients are very interested in looking at the data. We get things stabilized, operations are good. And I think the viewpoint that we're seeing very much now is, how can we first of all strengthen? So this is a very timely topic and a great topic. How can we strengthen those relationships? The boots on the ground, I think, is very easy, because as Ginger and William very articulately stated, and Yahweh talked about, we're all humans. We sit on this little blue ball, and there's only one, and it's not going to get any bigger. And people understand that. So the boots on the ground figure those things out very quickly. Businesses and governments complicate things, and they try to think a little bit more strategically and longer term. And predicting the future has become very difficult and very challenging. And so I think one of that just struck me, that there's 2 conversations that we're having.
Yeah.
Operational tactics, that's working well. The strategy of how we're going to move forward, it's a great opportunity to have broader conversations like this, to figure out how we can elevate those interpersonal relationships, because the way that the boots on the ground have fixed the operations is the interpersonal relationships have worked through those problems.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to say, like, panelists, if y'all want to jump in based on something somebody said, just wave at me, or let us know, and feel free to jump in. Also wanted to remind everybody about the Q&A box. We've got a few, I think 3 that have come in now, but y'all continue to put your questions in. I'll interweave them where I can, and also we'll have some time at the end. Ginger, I think, wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to PJ's comment about strategic thinking on it. And, one of the things I think that as leaders of companies that we can think about is as our impact to the community. So not just the business impact, but the communities where we operate, right? It can have such an influence on how the governments perceive us. So even, I'll give you an example. I have a very successful Chinese entrepreneur friend who brought his business to the US about 5 years ago. And he told me, he said, I'm always getting, problems from all the authorities, even though we do everything right. And I hired all these experts to follow the rules and everything. And I asked him, I said, what about your community engagement with your employees? And so he's like, what do you mean? And so we talked about that. And he got so much more relief and more open dialogue with those authorities when they started to do things in the community. That's something that, we as Milliken also in China, we do the same thing. letting the local Chinese colleagues identify those opportunities to have an impact in the communities. It sounds maybe a little cliche, but it certainly goes a long way for looking at things. And the authorities by and by hear about these things, and these things translate. And I think it helps to build those relationships from a strategic level and opening communication lines.
Right,
Yeah,
thanks.
I'd like to jump in there
Sure.
just quickly and just reinforce what Ginger said. You know, Prime Revenue we have a couple hundred employees around the world. We're a rounding error on Milliken's employees, but we take very much the same approach. And I am very much of the opinion that you started to see in the West, especially, where businesses are taking the lead. It may be cliche in the past. I think it's the way of the future. And I think I want to applaud this conversation, because if this problem is going to be solved, it is not going to be solved in the politicized world that we live in, where people just want to get in the corner of the room and scream at each other. That's politics. That's politics in the West at the moment. And unfortunately, that's the politics in the East at the moment. If we're going to solve these types of problems and challenges, it's going to take a business mindset where we have to sit down at a table. We have to understand that there's going to be cultural differences, and there's no right or wrong. There's just differences, and we have to figure out a way to move forward together. And I think one of the ways to establish that you're genuinely committed to the communities in which you live is doing exactly what Ginger just said. It has to be part of the business modus operandi moving forward. So thank you for saying that, Ginger. I think it's extremely important.
PJ, at risk of making you run a little bit long here, I wanted to ask you one quick thing about the data that you're seeing now. I mean, I think a lot of the saber rattling is premised on the idea that if we just put enough tension on China or pressure, then we'll see a lot of this manufacturing come back to the U.S. and we'll rebalance the trade relationship. Of course, every ambassador I hear from Southeast Asia is coming in with the statement that we can be your destination when you're moving away from China. Like, we're your guys, you know. So Vietnam has seen a lot of an influx of investment, and some other places in Asia too. Yet China remains really resilient in certain manufacturing sectors where it has massive scale that just can't be replicated. I just wondered if you see in your data any evidence that this decoupling is already starting to happen, since you tend to preempt the news.
So no, the short answer to the question is no, but there's some very interesting information or conclusions that you can draw from our data. The first is if you think about same store sales, so same supplier purchases is a way to think about that. So the volume of purchases that are being made with a given supplier year over year, we're seeing those back sort of to pre-COVID levels, almost, plus or minus a few percentage points. So we're not back to growth, but we've sort of gotten out of a massive trough. And to put that in perspective, Q2 we saw drops in between 30 and 40%. It was consistently, pick a sector, the volume of, and what that means for everybody that's thinking about it is that's trade, that's global trade, that's revenue for the suppliers was off 35% on average in Q2. So it's a dramatic drop and dramatic increases. So given where we were a year ago, we've sort of normalized back to what you would have expected, plus or minus a few percentages. So that's very good. We're also seeing the propensity of the suppliers to convert those invoices into cash faster or immediately very high. So, historically we run in our China suppliers specifically, we typically see them selling 70% of their invoices to get paid to convert those invoices into cash immediately. We're probably in the 80% range at the moment. So there is a desire to get cash. That creates stability, and it also provides cash for growth. At the same time, we're seeing a lot more suppliers being brought onto our platform by our buyers that are based in Western Europe and North America. So we continue to grow. So those things I think are those are anchors that we can sit down around the table. That's business that happens today, and those relationships are sticky. The solutions that we provide are sticky. If you design, as William was talking about, if you design a motor that's going to go to an impeller, that's going to go into a pump, that's going to be delivering, that's a design that takes a long time to figure out how to commercialize and deliver. And those relationships typically last for long periods of time.
Yeah.
We have to figure those out. Now, anecdotally, we also know that because of the disruption that was caused by COVID a year ago, and then the disruption that was created by politics and human rights issues and saber rattling and rhetoric and the failure to acknowledge a way for us to be able to get along and move towards the future, anecdotally, many of our buyer clients in the West are trying to figure out how to diversify their supply chains. And it is very much, as you would expect, it doesn't fit the narrative of either of the political sides. It is very much an and conversation. It is not an or conversation. I think as business leaders, you would be absolutely out of your mind if you fail to recognize the commercial opportunities for your business in China. If you ignore China and you're a global business, you're not really a global business. And the same is true with the US. As business leaders, we cannot help but think about the fact that we have to have a strategy for all of those things. So it very much has to be and. I would also say that if you're in a situation where China is unavailable to you as a supplier and you're not also thinking about how to have a plan B and a plan C to diversify your supply chain, that needs to be something that you're considering. And we're very much considering seeing that. I do really want to emphasize that it is an or, it is an and China type of discussion, not an or. It's not a movement away, but it's in addition to, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, your point about the interior market in China and how many companies are addressing that with their China operations, not just exporting from China, is a really important one. And I think it brought to mind to me one thing I've heard on a previous panel where apparently China has laid out this what it calls the dual circulation strategy, which is basically what it's been doing all along, which is build up the domestic manufacturing capacity for the domestic market in areas that are really strategic, but also continue this export-oriented strategy where it makes sense as well, but just maybe bifurcating that a little bit better than it had been previously and weighting it away from exports and more towards domestic consumption. But Yahweh, I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned the role of business, and I think we keep hearing that from all of our panelists right now. Are the governments open to feedback from business? I mean, is there a mechanism for the economic interest to really shape these strategic discussions, or is it that we are so firmly entrenched in our ways and that security sucks up all the energy in the conversation?
You're saying whether the Chinese government is responsive? Is this
really both sides? Yeah, I mean, of course. One of the big questions I've always had is how much does the Chinese government respond to economic shocks, right? Of course, it's very concerned with continuing growth, and we saw in the fourth quarter China back to 6% plus growth in 2020. But I'm just curious as to how it impacts the decision making of the Chinese government, and where you see the role of business in the U.S. government in terms of fostering dialogue that goes beyond the.
Thanks for that question. I think I sort of brief touched on that, is that the Chinese leadership understands how important the American market, the market of the Western countries, how important that is. It doesn't want to lose that market. China has benefited from globalization, and China has no desire whatsoever to disrupt globalization or global chain of supply. But China also understands how diabolically some of the American leaders are anti-China, and has to be, as PJ mentioned, every business has to have, plans for what is going to happen. And the Chinese government is actually pivoting to the fact that maybe all the allies of the US are going to cave into American pressure, that they're going to deny China's access to their market, that they're going to disrupt China's Belt and Road Initiative so that China's overcapacity cannot be quote unquote exported. So that's where the dual circulation comes in. But I think the Chinese leadership also understands that's actually easy easily said than done. You know, how are you going to convert the Chinese people suddenly overnight or over 5 years, you know, into consumers? That's very hard because Chinese like to save. They save for the apartment, they save for retirement, they save for their children's education, they save for their, you know, illness, and without political reform, without taking care of the benefit, the welfare of the Chinese people, it's not very easy to turn the market into China into a real market. On the American side, I think the hope, again, is on the businesses. You know, American government will always be responsive to demands from the business. The fact, as I mentioned earlier, is how American businesses see, you know, what China means for their business. You know, I think PJ mentioned, you know, if you don't think about the China market, you're not a global company. You know, if all companies believe that China is so important, then that pressure on President Biden now will be so grave that Biden will have to adapt, will have to revise the China policy that was in place, you know, in the last 4 years by the Trump administration.
Yeah, but I think that actually fuels some of the narratives too, the anti-China narratives, because you know, a lot of American companies have complained that their market access in China has not improved to the point that they had hoped, given, you know, this supposed gradual opening of China that everybody expected. And I wonder, you know, that seems to be a bipartisan consensus at this point, that, you know, China, while it opened up early on, you know, to get into the WTO, hasn't had the same, the pace of reforms that everybody expected and wanted to. Now, I do think there's a bit of a hypocrisy there too, because we're complaining about a trade deficit when a lot of American companies have, and we're complaining about intellectual property when we've entered into these relationships to get access to the market. So I guess my question for you, Yahweh, is where do these bigger strategic questions about what we thought China was going to be when they entered the WTO, like where do those complaints have merit? Where has China failed to live up to its promise of reform and maybe game the system in certain areas? Because I think that's really the thing that we have to get over if we're going to have a real conversation.
I remember when U.S. And China were negotiating on China's ascendancy to WTO. In China, a lot of people say, if we're going to join WTO, that means our domestic industry are all going to be destroyed. You know, the whole market is going to be flooded by Western products. You know, there's going to be no China down the road. And then, you know, China has benefited from that. You know, on the issue of climate change, it's the same thing. Because when U.S. is working so hard to convince China to join the global effort, you know, to stall and stop climate change, the Chinese side, the elite, saying, if we're going to join that effort, you know, our economy is going to be slowed down. And then, you know, it's a Western conspiracy to destroy the Chinese economy. Now things have flipped. President Trump actually said, climate change is a Chinese conspiracy, you know, to destroy American manufacturing industry. So I think the thinking on the WTO, on the China side, is changing. And if you look at the first phase trade agreement, you know, China are actually making all the effort to allow American businesses to have equal access to the China market, to allow American business to set up shop with 100% ownership, you know, which before is unthinkable. And the American financial sector, I think they're having a field day in China now because of what China has done in the past 2 years. So I think China is making effort to, one big issue, which I didn't talk about, is how the Chinese government is going to deal with its SOE sector.
Yeah, we had a question in the chat about that too.
That's the huge challenge. If China doesn't reform that, if China doesn't allow American or other European businesses to compete with China's SOE sector on equal terms, then things will be very tough in the coming years.
Yeah, I wanted to ask William about that too, and we'll get into these questions. And please do put your questions in the Q&A, and maybe we'll get back into SOEs a little bit too, because That's a fascinating question. But William, in terms of the motivations for Chinese companies coming to the U.S. market, Yahweh talked about how important the U.S. market is for any global company, right? And are they coming in now to basically prove that they can compete? Has the calculus changed from previously when the government was sort of incentivizing Chinese companies to go global? Are they doing it on their own merit now?
You know what? The business leaders always follow the business logic. So inside business logic, the environment is difficult, including such kind of political situations. It's a part of their logic. So I no matter what dynamics happens, I believe those business leaders always follow this way. Going to the global market, you have to go do the global investment, no matter it's in Europe and the US. It's the same consideration in long terms. And the secondary, those business leaders understand in terms of supply chain. In the future, it's no longer a supply chain, be a vendor or supplier, like Pierre mentioned that. It's really about, and what is subject to the multiple values you can contribute to the supply chain. So it's really a value chain. It's about, what's the value you can contribute for such industries or such kind of the chain. So if you stay in old school, and just like I'm vendor, I can do the manufacturing, I do a kind of assembly, I just contribute a little labor cost saving. So that page is no longer, at least no longer between the business, China and the US.
Yeah. One quick question I wanted to ask you, William. Do you see mergers and acquisitions as being a preferred method to enter the US market these days, more so than in the past, when many more manufacturers were setting up greenfield factory operations?
I don't know it's preferred or not for the couples in the past several years, and such kind of way to do investment, just because most of the Chinese leaders, they are not familiar about US business culture and business operations, and better to have someone to buy a company and have keep the whole team to operate. Like what our company do, we do investment here. We send almost zero Chinese to the US to working for those entities.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I've seen more acceptance on this end too, to that avenue for investment too. It used to be that we would only cheer for those investments that set up new factories, and now I think the people recruiting investment are more open to the idea that Chinese company could bring in capital, equipment, know-how, retain the team locally, and actually build from there. So I'm going to go to the Q&A now. We've got we're going to go till 4:30, so we've got about 20 minutes to jump into some of this stuff, and I don't want to monopolize the conversation too much more. But the first one, I guess, would probably be best for Yahweh, but anybody else who wants to jump into it. This is from Ken Hardy. He says the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, has a track record of using the 1,000 Talents program to steal technology from the US and Europe, and placing spies in sensitive political positions to influence US policy. And he's talking about this situation with the California Democratic representative. So I guess, Yahweh, you've seen this in action at Emory. I want to broaden the question a bit. Is that question valid, for one? I mean, is the 1,000 Talents program being used to steal technology? And then what is the broader basis from which we should calibrate our academic engagement between the US and China? Because that has too become a major battleground, because China has obviously been suspected of nefarious activity for a long time, and in certain cases has been shown to be engaging in that kind of activity. So how do you frame that conversation?
I think that the conversation has to be framed as the follows. So the 1,000 talent program by China is actually a response to the massive brain drain China has suffered. Because if you look at the statistics, I think probably over close to 80% of the Chinese who came here and pursued a STEM degree, doctorate degree, did not return to China. So, that's the first response. These people are here in the US, they're conducting research, and, maybe we can set up a program so they can also come and back to China and work with researchers in China. Most of these researchers are basic research that will benefit both China and the US. However, it also has to be framed in the sense that what these researchers do, those who are chosen by the 1,000 talent program are not going to infringe upon US intellectual property. They're not going to, as our guest said, they're not going to be involved in industrial espionage. But it's very hard to define, what is espionage and what is legitimate academic exchange. I think Henry Paulson basically said, the way to approach that, the US has to be sensitive to national security, is basically to have very high fence with a small yard. There are crown jewels of the American technology. Those have to be protected. But outside that crown jewel, everything else, should be exchanged on equal terms between Chinese and Americans. I think the China initiative at the Justice Department is a racial profiling operation. And that has to be stopped. And you mentioned, Emory, we learned about recent arrest of the professor at MIT. So far, I don't think we have one single case of conviction of one ethnic Chinese or Chinese American researcher being convicted of espionage. There's one trial that will happen, I think, involving a professor of University of Kansas. This is the first one that basically said he's not going to settle any of the smaller charges like wire fraud or tax evasion and things like that. So I think this is a very politically charged issue, but there's a lot of racism, profiling in this so-called campaign to catch and eliminate spies. We all have to be very much aware how much ethnic Chinese or Chinese Americans have contributed to the innovation of the US.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what part of the issue too is that China still keeps its own high-tech sectors very much walled off from the rest of the world, and so and there's a big deficit if you think about it in those terms of Chinese scholars and students coming to the U.S. versus U.S. scholars going that way, and in very high-tech fields. And of course, Georgia Tech was the venue where former Secretary of State Pompeo used his bully pulpit there to talk about how big of a threat China was to the academic community. So I don't know, hopefully maybe this conversation will shift in a more productive direction, but it does seem like there are some lingering concerns. And Ginger?
Can I just to comment, I would say Chinese are not bad people. All bad people are not Chinese. There are bad Americans, there are bad Germans, there are bad French, there are bad Slovakians, right? And I think that a lot of this stuff that we're talking about is somewhat historical. It's what we saw maybe 50 years ago, but it's definitely evolved. It doesn't mean that it won't happen, and it doesn't mean that a Canadian won't get nabbed in Beijing next week for espionage, right? So I think what we can do is to propagate the positive aspects of how far China has come in terms of intellectual property protection for companies that are investing there. And I personally have experienced that, where we've been able to defend our intellectual property in China effectively without spending a lot of money, but by getting support from the government, right? So I think we can help to spread that news, because a lot of people are living, my mother's one, living in the past and how it used to be 50 years ago, right? And it's changed a lot. So
yeah, and I mean, I think the name of the game is nuance, right? None of this stuff is cut and dried or black and white. there's merit to the idea that, you know, certain folks have infringed on intellectual property, but there's also plenty of productive relationships going on. So there's the key is getting into the weeds a little bit more and not being so simplistic in our explanations of things, I think. We had one from someone asking about how does an emerging economy like India and the growing Indo-US trade relationship impact the initiatives this group is taking? And I just kind of wondered, I wanted to throw that to PJ because I wondered if you've just seen any shift toward India. It feels like strategically the US has turned quite a bit toward India and you know, but yet India has not been able to show itself to be able to replace China just yet.
Yeah,
so
not, you know, there's a very big difference in terms of the sort of national strategy from a different perspective. Very capable businesses and supply chains and availability in a very interesting market. It's just, I think, as I mentioned before, India must be an and conversation. The differences are dramatic and material, and I don't think it can be. There's very little of you know, sort of that you can think about from Indo-US or China-US relationship at any level within business that you can really think about as an and, other than if you're going to fly 24 hours to get to that part of the world, you probably want to visit both, which is not that's not a good. William said it incredibly well. When he talked about, you know, business people are going to solve business problems. The business problems in India are very different than the business problems and challenges and opportunities that exist in China. So I think it's an and of an allocation of resources and somewhat of a different direction.
And also thinking about the massive Indian market too, right? I mean, even though middle class has not quite gotten to the Chinese level, I mean, it's still, you've got what's going to be very soon, if it's not already, the most populous country in the world with a growing middle class. So,
but consumer tastes are different, culture is different,
exactly,
legal systems
and it's
different, methods of delivery are different. It is not, you can't say, okay, I'm done with China, I'm going to move on. It is completely different. It's you're going to a different space.
And it's not one thing. I mean, India is very diverse, as well as everybody knows. So, John Ling, who formerly ran Chinese investment for South Carolina and Georgia, he I think that's the same John Ling here. He's asking. He said it's refreshing to hear that Milliken is actually open-minded and helping work with inbound Chinese projects. And he said it wasn't always the case. It wasn't always that way, in his opinion. So he was wondering, why is there a shift in this point of view? And was that a leadership decision or better understanding about the Chinese market, or what drove that?
Probably all of the above. Yeah, I'm relatively new to Milliken, so I can't comment on past stance on that. But I can say, you know, we have a new CEO for about 2.5 years, Halsey Cook, who comes with, first of all, he's a visionary leader. He comes with a wealth of international experience in a number of very big companies. So I think his vision for that and his understanding and appreciation for that has helped drive more investment in China. It was started long before he came, but I think the seriousness and the investment level that we're doing now in China is largely part of his vision as well.
I think he was also talking about helping the Chinese companies come to the U.S. You had mentioned that you sort of played the role of consultant with some of your business partners.
Yeah, I think that's been driven all the way down to the division levels and even the business unit levels, right? In working with our Chinese customers and seeing the opportunities that they have to come to the U.S. for the supply chain reasons, right? The interruptions that we had and the tariffs that we had. We see it being mutually beneficial for the company. So I think that there's again, it's about this building this mutually beneficial relationship. We see it as a positive thing. Yeah.
Cool. Great. Thank you. So we got Henry Yu here, who's asked, for American companies interested in Asia, you know, of course, China's irreplaceable, the 800-pound gorilla, as he calls it. Which countries would be priority number one from a risk diversification compliance perspective? Would China still be the preferred destination in terms of strategy? even despite the low point, the U.S.-China relationship being at a low point, or do you see that other countries make the most sense in terms of your longer term strategy? I think we've kind of touched on that, but if anybody wants to add something to that.
The only thing that I would say, I don't know if Henry can add commentary to that, but it completely, my answer would be, it completely depends on what type of business you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good assessment. All right, we'll move on. And this is from Penny Prime from the China Research Center. She says, maybe for Ginger, one of the complaints against China is that it is not liberalized or opened or changed. Penny's experience is the opposite in terms of how the economy and society works. From a business point of view, are there examples of where the environment has become more sophisticated, competitive, and examples where it has not?
Yeah, I would agree with you, with Penelope, in that I think the competitive landscape, it was a bit unlevel, I would say 10, 15 years ago. And even in my time in China, I saw it's it's not maybe fully level, but it's definitely the degree of incline has changed. You see the enforcement of environmental regulations being more uniform for local companies versus international. You see that the processes for expansions and for doing investments becoming more uniform, more clear. So I think it's becoming more and more level and more uniform across. So it's not quite there. We've still got some room to go. And I think that also the authority management part of the aspect of it still plays a big role, and it's important for companies to understand that playing field.
Yeah, it's interesting. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Trevor. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
But I was just going to comment on that as well. And I would encourage Penelope to be vocal, right? I think that's part of it. At the end of the day, I think we've all been in the fortunate situation to see businesses make millions of decisions. None of us have ever seen a business make a single decision. It's people that make decisions. So it's the people relationships that occur. And at the end of the day, when I say business leaders need to step up, that's one of the things I think that's really critical. If you're listening in a self-fulfilling news cycle and only listening to the news that you want to hear, you're going to believe that it's 50 years ago. But if you listen to people that you trust and you tell those stories about the progression, the progressive aspects that have occurred within the region, I think that is absolutely critical. So the reality is, if you think that China is in the Stone Age, you haven't been there. If you think that they're just driving around throwing people into jail, you haven't been there. And that doesn't mean that there aren't areas for improvement. I do think that we are in a very volatile environment right now, partially because of the rhetoric that we've created, partially because of I think the potential that the CCP feels like maybe things have progressed a little bit too far and they've lost control. And so it does feel like there's a tightening in the more liberal areas of business for us. There's concern not only with our expats, but there's great concern with our Chinese nationals, around the world, because we move people all over the world about the crackdowns. What happens in Taiwan is petrifying to many business owners. And so, it doesn't mean that it's not perfect, but I think that example where Penelope has that experience, there's an opportunity for all of us within our networks to share the message that there has been there is a paradigm that there has not been liberalization, that there has not been progressive progress made with the way that things occur. And the reality is, most Americans, if they were dropped into Shanghai, would be shocked at the infrastructure, how much better it is than the United States, right? We live in a globalized world. We need to understand that. And the only way that our citizens are going to understand that, our colleagues are going to understand that, is to hear from people like Penelope that have had that experience.
Yeah, and I think on the openness issue, it's like every other discussion with China. It's like both and. I mean, it's true somewhere and it's not in another. It's true in one sector and it's not in another. And it's sort of a double-edged sword. Like, depending on where you are in China, it can be the most open environment in the world because that local government has that, like to Ginger's point, has that initiative, and they want to bring in foreign companies in that sector, and you can find it to be incentivized to the max. yeah, in certain sectors, you have to have a 50% partner. You have to, theoretically turn over some of your technology. And so it's just, it depends, right? Like you said, PJ, depends on the sector, depends on the place. But yeah, I think that the trend is definitely toward more engagement with the world. It's just a question of on whose terms. I think that's the big bilateral discussion going on right now. So we've got one other question from Jorge Fernandez. He asks, what is the current or projected landscape for continued academic exchanges and programs of U.S. universities in China? And that's an interesting question because he doesn't really say students. I think he's talking about actually, U.S. Universities having their operations in China. We know that a lot of universities have campuses in various locations around China. And I guess maybe that's a question for Yahweh among this panel.
I think as far as I know, these American universities that have campuses in China, NYU in Shanghai, Duke in Kunshan, I think Georgia Tech, our own Georgia Tech in Shenzhen.
Yep.
Yeah, they're all operational. I think to recruit students, including Chinese students. These campuses are not just designed to recruit Chinese students. They are doing recruitment globally. So they're all operational, which means the leaders of these universities and colleges, they still have confidence in China. They believe the place where China has, in this new global order. So I think that exchange is going to continue. Secondly, Chinese students, their parents, they still want their children to come over here because US has the best education institutions in the world. Once COVID-19 is gone, once visa restrictions are lifted, because right now there are restrictions on Chinese students that went to college in Chinese university that believed to have closer relationship with the Chinese military. They're not going to be issued visas. Mm-hmm. I think the Biden administration probably will remove these restrictions because it's really hard to determine, whether these students are going to be more dangerous than the other students. And so I'm confident that the exchanges will continue. I think there is this exaggerated fear of things such as Confucius Institute. I think US is a much better country and a more confident country than to allow Confucius Institute to come over here and to offer Chinese language instruction and things like that. Universities will do a much better job than the federal government imposing restrictions. I think President Biden and his administration is doing just that to ask universities and colleges, to look at these Chinese operations and make sure, they're here doing what they're supposed to do. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's parsing out propaganda from just dialogue, right? Like that's the big question. And I don't know if anybody knows how to do that and divorce it from some of the higher temperature rhetoric that we've seen. So we had one question about whether you have sea turtles, Haigwei, in your business. I'm assuming y'all may know what that means, but I think it's returned, overseas Chinese who've returned back home and integrated into companies in their homeland. So I don't know what the motivation behind that question is. I guess it's kind of like, are these people effective at bridging the cultural divide? Maybe. I don't know who that's for. Maybe Ginger.
I can answer the question. We do.
Yeah.
And we also, we also have Chinese nationals that have never traveled outside of the region, and we have expats. We have a combination. And we try to sort of focus on a global culture first, and that seems to be working. We don't differentiate those, and we don't seek out that profile by any stretch. We look for talented people, and if there's talented people, then we worry about where they've been and what their background has been and those types of things.
Cool. Anybody else want to jump on that?
I would say exactly the same.
Okay, cool. I'm going to try to sneak in one last question on SOEs. We got, I think it may be Jimson. I don't know. He asks, many of the international companies in China depend on ecosystems of small specialized companies in their industries. And as you know, we've got like various, you know, the Christmas decoration town in China and the fireworks town and like all these segmented manufacturing environments. I guess Jim's asking, how significant are state-owned enterprises in the global supply chain, and are their financing issues different? And I don't know who wants to tackle that monster of a question, but I think we have seen, you know, certain state-owned companies going overseas differently and having access to different capital sources, obviously, than those who are not deemed strategic for the Chinese government. But do y'all have any insights on that? That'll be our last question.
I mean, my perspective is by no stretch data-driven, but anecdotal. And so my primary answer would be there's no difference from a competitive perspective, a financing perspective. It's not like the state is going to provide a fiscal guarantee against anything. It more has to do with maybe the same thing that the U.S. would do with respect to stimulus or investments or subsidies to build a center of excellence around a particular industry, and it may have to do with seeding, the seed funding and being able to establish the business or establish the expansion. In my experience, we don't have a lot of defense related or anything like that, but in general industry for consumer products and white goods manufacturing, automotive manufacturing, we do have a lot of experience and a lot of clients and a lot of experience in those industries. And so as the business is up and running on an ongoing basis, we don't see a difference.
Great. Well, thank y'all so much. I want to thank our panelists. I mean, I feel like we could keep going for a while and had some great engagement and questions from the audience. So I really feel like we hit on a lot of interesting points that will be fodder for future discussions for sure. And I want to thank our panelists again, thank our hosts, and 新年快乐 to everybody out there, maybe those of you who are joining us from China. And I just wanted to thank y'all for having me as well. So everybody have a good rest of your day, and we will look forward to the next one.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.